Part 2 of Iceberg Dead Ahead, a Titanic message from God.
It took 25,000 tons of steel. It took assembled by 15,000 men over 2 years, and all that was destroyed in just a matter of minutes. All it took, ladies and gentlemen, was the right kinds of conditions to expose the fatal weakness. As Titanic began to sink, as she made her 2-mile descent to the bottom of the sea, great forces, great pressure was working on the hull of the ship. In fact, she broke in half and left debris spread out over an area a mile long. Her hull fragments littered the seabed like broken pottery. Now, I want to point out that around the wreck of the Titanic, there are large debris fields, and the largest debris fields are coal fields. Now, go back to our scripture. God says, in an instant it will break in pieces like pottery, shattered so mercilessly that among its pieces not a fragment will be found for taking coals from a hearth or scooping water out of a cistern. That's interesting to me. Now, although several artifacts over the years have been removed from the wreck site, no significant piece of the ship has been recovered. Because really, at the depth that it is at, it's simply impossible. Furthermore, tests have concluded that microorganisms are slowly but surely eating away at Titanic's hull. In effect, the ship is turning to dust. Chances are it will simply disintegrate before technology will allow for any large-scale recovery. So much for this ship that God couldn't sink. Now, let me read to you from Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. It says, "There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." In the over 80 years since the unsinkable liner went down, the Titanic has become sort of a historical enigma. Perhaps because of its reputation, we forget that the White Star Line's proudest achievement probably was the greatest human accomplishment of her time, both technologically and culturally. But, as we're going to show you, from the very moment her keel was laid, it seemed as if she were destined for disaster. Okay, now first I want you to consider this. Back in 1898, a writer by the name of Morgan Robertson wrote a book about a fabulous Atlantic liner far larger than any that had ever been built. On his fictional ship, he placed the world's most rich and famous people, and then he wrecked it on a cold April night on an iceberg. He called the book Futility. He called the ship in his book Titan. In Futility, he forecast not only the name, but the size of the ship and even the location of where the iceberg damage would come. Now, that's amazing. That is amazing. In just 14 short years, you see what happened. What this man wrote actually happened. Now, I want to point out here, I think it's odd that this man wrote this book in 1898, exactly 100 years ago. And I'm just going to drop this in, and you go back and look it up for yourself and chew on this. It's probable that Noah spent 100 years building the ark. And that's all I'll say, and I'll just go on. Now, there was a first-class passenger on Titanic by the name of William Sneed. He was a writer as well. He had written not only of a liner sunk by ice, but had in another story written about a sinking ship with insufficient lifeboats. In this particular novel, a great loss of life occurred. In an 1892 article, he wrote a story about an ocean passage from England to the United States. The fictional voyage was based on the real White Star vessel called Majestic. In his story, Majestic was on her way to collect survivors from a ship that had foundered after a collision with an iceberg. Oddly enough, the captain of the Titanic, Edward J. Smith, at one time had been the master of Majestic. Sneed, the writer, had been recently warned to stay away from ocean travel. He told many people aboard that. In fact, he told these people that he had recently had a dream of being in a shipwreck and calling for help. Of course, Mr. Sneed did not survive. Now, those are strange coincidences in the story of Titanic. Let me give you a couple other strange things that happened. Before heading out to open sea, or I should back up just a moment. When the ship Titanic was built in Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland today, and before they could take passengers on, the ship had to do sea trials. That occurred on April 2nd of 1912. Well, on the very day that she pulled out of Belfast to conduct her sea trials, a fire started in a coal bunker, and it just happened to be coal bunker number 6, which it was in the forward compartments. This was one of the bunkers that would later get flooded. This fire burned until the very day before the collision. So all this time, while these passengers were going on about their business, there was a fire burning down below. Only the captain and some of the officers and the people, of course, fighting the fire knew about it. And a lot of people didn't know that that was the case. It's possible that this fire helped to weaken the hull, is the point. Okay, let's continue. Some of the strange coincidences surrounding Titanic, or forebodings, I should say. Before it headed out to open sea with passengers aboard, I may add, it almost collided with 2 different ships on one occasion. It's noteworthy for us to recall that Titanic's launch date was delayed due to the collision of her sister ship, the Olympic. The Olympic collided with a Royal Navy ship and had to be towed back, had to be towed back to be repaired. And so, as they repaired Olympic, the work on the Titanic slowed to a near halt. So what this did was it caused her launch date, which was supposed to have been in March, pushed it back to April. And by doing that, it ensured her date with destiny. Because what if she had been launched at her original time? Chances are she may not have hit the iceberg. So here's the point. There were things happening that seemed to be putting Titanic on a course with destiny. What if the Olympic had missed that Navy ship? Well, of course, she would have sailed in March. By the way, the Olympic's captain, this ship that collided with this Navy ship, the captain was none other than Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic. In fact, Captain Smith, who was considered to be a safe captain, had several mishaps with ships. He commanded another ship called the Germanic, which capsized in New York Harbor years before. So there are a lot of what-ifs. In fact, there's too many for us to go into and discuss here. But here's what comes through. It's clear that through human error, weather conditions, other factors, etc., all occurred in their proper order, in their proper place, and time, and they combined to provide an unalterable formula for disaster. Therefore, we conclude, and we think it's reasonable to conclude, that many people of that era, after the Titanic catastrophe, would have interpreted it as a wake-up call from God. Now, furthermore, we have to consider this too, that this tragic tale of the Titanic, we believe that God is sending our generation a warning, perhaps our last. And I want you to contemplate Titanic's message. The great steamer represented the very best the Edwardian world had to offer. Abundance, extravagance, amusement, food, drink, song, perceived safety, perceived security. It was considered unsinkable and impenetrable. Titanic was the ultimate in human endeavor. It was the pinnacle of man's ingenuity. The builders, crew, the passengers were on this giant materialistic and indulgent binge. They had no thought of the imminent danger. They had no thought of destruction. They had no thought of death. And all the time it lay just ahead. Their idea was eat, drink, and be merry. And despite numerous warnings, the Titanic raced on to her date with destiny. Now, ladies and gentlemen, like Titanic, that's the state of the world that we live in today. And in particular, I want to focus in on the United States. Our nation is is in that predicament. We're steaming ahead with confidence. We're oblivious to the dangers ahead of us. Why should we be concerned? The average citizen would ask, I guess. All these changing weather patterns, increase in violent crime, a host of other problems are all dismissed as inconsequential. People are so content with their life, with the way things are, that character and integrity and leadership doesn't even matter anymore. All people care about is if I got money in my hip pocket. There's no thought of eternal values. There's certainly no thought of an impending judgment. In fact, for you and I to believe in those things and to voice these opinions, we're just considered to be right-wing religious fanatics. People feel that the times are good, nothing's wrong. Ignore those silly warnings. Full steam ahead. Let's face it. People, warnings have been coming for the last several years. The floods, the earthquakes, the mudslides, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, all these different things. God has been sending gentle, comparatively speaking, gentle warnings to us to wake up, to turn our lives around, to turn our nation around. And yet, they've been ignored. We're just like those people on the Titanic. We have disregarded the warnings. We've disregarded the ice warnings, as it were. I talked to you about the hull of the Titanic, this brittle steel, hidden imperfections. We too, underlying all these seemingly great things about our nation, underlying that there are serious imperfections. There are serious things about our society, about our nation, that are going to be exploited by the right kinds of conditions. Make no doubt about it, ladies and gentlemen. Eventually, the conditions are going to rise to exploit these things that are seriously wrong in our society. There is an iceberg out there looming on the horizon. Right now, we don't know when that will be. It may be days, it may be weeks, it may be months. But it's very, very close. Now, let me read another scripture here. This is found in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 24, starting with verse 24. Because I have called and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand and no man regarded. You have set at naught all my counsel and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear comes. When your fear comes as desolation and your destruction comes as a whirlwind. When distress and anguish comes upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For that they hated knowledge, and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel. They despised all my reproof. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way, and be filled with their own devices. Proverbs 1:24 through 31. You remember the what-ifs that we mentioned earlier. What if the Titanic had not tried to maneuver around the iceberg? If you recall earlier, I said that the command to hard a starboard and full astern was the last in a long line of bad decisions made by the crew and the leadership of the ship. What if he had never given that order? What if he had decided to strike the iceberg head on? Here's what we've learned by examining the shipwreck. Experts explain that if this had happened, if it had been struck head on, though the Titanic would have been crippled, she would have stayed afloat, and she could have limped into Halifax, Nova Scotia, and there she could have been repaired. Later, she could have returned to sea service and served the White Star Line for many years. The tragic mistake occurred when First Officer Murdoch tried to get around the obstacle. That's human nature, right? It compels us to try to avoid problems that we have, to get around the obstacles in our life. As Christians, a lot of times we say, well, that's the devil trying to hinder me. You know, we have to realize that some of the foolhardy decisions that we make during our life is what brings us some of these problems. It's the decision and the choices that we make that sets us on a particular course. And when we encounter these problems, what do? We try to get around them. We try to change our course. We try to get out of this collision that we're heading toward. Unfortunately, sometimes God has to use these devastating obstacles to get our attention. And I'm talking to Christians too. And I'm talking to myself as well. But even though God sometimes has to use some perhaps violent method, some tragic method to get our attention, to get us to want to be different, to get us to change, they don't necessarily have to be fatal. If we could learn to deal with our problems head on, instead of trying to get around them, and instead of trying to deny that they're there, instead of trying to find an easier way out, if we could just learn to deal with them, to meet them head on, we'd be a lot better off. Because see, ladies and gentlemen, it's a dangerous thing for us to try to skirt God's correction, His urging us to change. Sooner or later, there's going to come a time when the rebellious attitudes, the rebellious lifestyles reap what they have sown. That is what happened to Titanic, and I fear to say that is what is happening and will happen to our nation. We are just like Titanic. A lot of people think that the Titanic was a British ship, and it was built by British, and it was commanded by the British. But very few people realize that it was owned by Americans. You've probably heard of John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, a wealthy, wealthy man. He headed up a group of Americans who owned this ship. So it was American-owned. And that's very interesting, isn't it? See, our nation is like that Titanic. Instead of dealing with our problems, we try to sail around them. We hear this all the time. Morality, who are you to tell me what's moral and what's not moral? Morality is relevant to the times. It's a different day. Or you've heard this, it's my body. You can't tell me what to do with it. I'll do what I want to. Or maybe you've heard this, we need to tolerate alternative lifestyles. Maybe you've heard this one, we are evolving into gods. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of thinking is a sure sign that we're headed for disaster. Now, as believers, we all know that. That's not a big revelation. But here's something that is. It's sad but necessary, but God is going to allow us to reap what we have sown. He is going to let us learn our lesson. He is going to let us strike that iceberg. Perhaps if that happens, then people will begin to change their hearts. We can only hope that that's the case. Now, remember back the ship that could have aided in Titanic's rescue? What was the name of it? It was the Californian. It was the same ship who tried to warn the Titanic but was told to shut up. And do you remember the name of the ship's captain? His name was Lord, Lord. The one who could have come to her rescue didn't. Now, do you see what I'm saying? It's hard to believe, for some at least, that God would not intervene if our nation began to crumble. But I want you to think about it. As a nation, we've told God, we don't need you. We don't want you. Hush, shut up. We're busy. So when we begin to see the results of our ways and it begins to become painfully evident that God's not going to rescue us this time, maybe people will change. Now, I know that some of you think, well, God cares for His people. Yeah, and that's true. He does. He cares for His people in the midst of difficult times. There were a small number of survivors on the Titanic, yet from the very moment they stepped into those lifeboats, their lives changed forever. And that's what I'm telling you. God will care for His people in the midst of trouble, but we've got to prepare. Now, I want to remind you, God can choose whatever vehicle He wishes to. Remember Balaam's donkey. He spoke through a donkey that way. And what did the donkey do? He warned Balaam to turn aside. I believe that is what is happening now. God is going to get His message out to those who are listening with spiritual ears, and He can do it whichever way He wishes. So if they're listening, if they're paying attention, they can glean something from this. Now I want you to consider the following information. The name Titanic is derived from the word Titan. Titan is a word that comes to us from Greek mythology. The Titans were a group of large beings, large supernatural beings who tried to overthrow the gods of Mount Olympus. They were eventually defeated and cast down and consigned to the lowest region of the underworld. That should sound familiar to you. By the way, the name of the compartment where they were confined was Tartarus. Tartarus is the word that Peter uses in 2 Peter 2 verse 4, which says, God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, or Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. So what we conclude is that Titanic is a name associated with rebellion. It's associated with judgment. Furthermore, this ship sank in the Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean's name is derived from Atlas, who was one of the Titans of Greek mythology. Atlas fought with the Titans in the war against the deities of Mount Olympus. You remember the sister ship to Titanic was the Olympic Olympus. An ocean named after a Titan claims the life of another Titan, the Titanic. Is that coincidence? Now, let me continue here in this vein. Legend has it that the Atlantic is responsible for yet another great catastrophe. According to the tradition of antiquity, there once existed a large island in the, quote, Western Ocean, which would be the Atlantic, called Atlantis. Plato records the history of Atlantis and depicts the nation as a utopian superpower. Yet, according to tradition, Atlantis was said to have been engulfed by the Atlantic Ocean as a result of an earthquake. In other words, in one day, this great civilization, this utopian superpower, was destroyed. Scholars have identified Atlantis, or I should say, tentatively identified the Atlantis with the island of Crete, or some the Canary Islands. Some have said it's the Scandinavian Peninsula, and some have even said that it is the Americas. Now, that's interesting to me. Could this great society have once existed somewhere in the Americas? Could that have happened? If that's the case, could these seemingly strange ties to Titanic be by chance? Now, the word Titan, from which Titanic is derived, is closely related to the name Titus. This name should sound familiar to students of biblical history. Titus was the man who in 70 A.D., and I want you to note the date, 70 A.D., destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Josephus records that for years, signs were pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. In fact, one of those signs was a comet. Yet, people refused to believe that God was going to allow this to happen. The only people that we know to have escaped this tragedy were the Christians who had heeded the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 21, where he told them, when you see these things happen, flee to the wilderness, flee to the mountains. Now, whether we want to believe it or not, the signs of an impending judgment on our nation are numerous, and we've already talked about some of those. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't need to take an ostrich-like attitude about the day in which we live. I've talked with people, in private conversations about the subject matter, about the dangers that our country faces right now, and in our responsibility to prepare for them, not only spiritually, but mentally, physically, emotionally. Most people's, or I shouldn't say most, a lot of people's response is, well, I'm just going to trust God. I'm just going to believe God's going to take care of us. And ladies and gentlemen, I believe that as well. However, in every biblical example that I've given you, I've shown you that not only was there a spiritual responsibility, but there was a literal physical responsibility as well. It is going to require preparation on our part. If we believe that this is going to happen, if we believe that this is coming, it requires physical, tangible, literal preparation for us to get ready. The Christians who escaped the destruction of the temple by Titus and the destruction of Jerusalem, where people were put to the sword and killed and slaughtered, those people who escaped had to do something physically. They had to literally get out of Jerusalem. You know what's going to happen if these things that we're thinking are going to happen, if they actually do happen, and this nation strikes that iceberg and starts going down, and those kind of situations don't distinguish between a child of God and a heathen. Only God can do that. And God sends warnings. And those people who don't prepare for what's going to happen, though they say they're just going to trust God, what they are going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is later on they're going to be on their knees saying, God, why did you let this happen? Why didn't you take care of me? Where were you? And what I'm saying to you is that God is speaking through these warnings, through different people. He's trying to get your attention. He's trying to tell you, a believer, God is trying to tell you, get ready. I'm telling you now so you can prepare later. Okay, I'm going to move on. Now, maybe you're not convinced that there's something to the Titanic story. There's not a warning coming through the Titanic story from God. Now, I want you to consider these very strange facts. The movie Titanic opened just before Christmas of 1997. Just a few weeks later, it was declared to be the largest grossing film of all time. That announcement came during the Hebrew month of Tevet. The Hebrew the Hebrew root of the name Tevet is probably related to tava, which means to sink. Interesting. For several weeks thereafter, Titanic remained on top at the box office. As the 70th Academy Awards approached, the talk of the town was whether Titanic was going to steal the show. In fact, we know it did. The Titanic won 11 Oscars. So, big deal. What's so important about that? Shouldn't we find it at least interesting that the Titanic won all this acclaim at the 70th Academy Awards? Could this possibly allude to the year 70 A.D., when Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple Mount? Now, I want to note here that one of the first ships to receive a distress call from the Titanic was called the Mount Temple. According to E.F. Vallow in his book Keys to Scripture Numerics, the number 11 is associated usually with disorder and judgment. And his interpretation is corroborated by E.W. Bullinger in his book, Number in Scripture. Now, with this information in mind, isn't it interesting, at least interesting, that Titanic received 11 Oscars? Is this just a fluke of history? Or, as I believe, is God using secular media to send out a warning to those who are willing to hear? Now, you're going to have to decide that and judge that for yourself. Luke chapter 17, verse 27, Jesus said they did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered in the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in those days. We're in the days of Noah. Just as it was in those days when the flood took these people by surprise. For Titanic, that end came very suddenly as well. Very few people escaped. Some did, though. But most went to icy deaths. The ship that God couldn't sink sunk. And as that vessel plunged to her final resting place, she took with her the confidence that man had placed in himself. Just like the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was this great human accomplishment, and it was in defiance of God. And they became so enamored with themselves that they defied God. And of course, we know the outcome of that story. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that Titanic's story is one for the hour in which we live. I believe that we are headed for a date with destiny. I believe there is something very ominous ahead in our future if we do not prepare for it, if we do not have right relationship with God, and if we don't heed God's warnings. The only hope this world had is the Lord. It's very important that we do not ignore His warnings. It's very important that we don't tell Him to shut up. It's very important that we keep that right relationship with Him. He's going to see us through the problems which lie ahead. But don't want you to be distracted and take a flippant attitude about this. There is an iceberg out there, and it's got America's name on it, and we're heading toward it. Now, I'm going to change up just a little bit and go in a little different direction, but yet try to tie this all together. Matthew 18, verse 21. The Bible says, Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? And Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto you until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Now, most people would interpret this to mean that the Lord is just saying that you forgive your brother every time. And I would agree with that interpretation, that we are to forgive those who come and ask us for forgiveness. But I think that beyond that, the Lord is alluding to something here. If Jesus was a rabbi, and we have to think like a rabbi, and we have to understand that He teaches as a rabbi, I think He's alluding to something, and I think what He's alluding to is Daniel chapter 9. Of course, what is 70 times 7? It is 490. So Jesus is saying, you forgive until 490 times. But let me ask you, what happens at 490 plus 1? Now, the 490, as I believe, Jesus is alluding to the 490 years mentioned in Daniel 9, which talks about the 70 weeks of Daniel. I believe there's more to what he's saying. Of course, if you go and look at that scripture, you understand that at the end of this 490-year cycle, which will end iniquity, at the end of that cycle, the King of Kings begins to judge the nations, and He establishes His rule. Now, we believe that there is a connection between America and Israel, not just politically, but religion is not the right word, spiritually. There is a connection between our two countries. Now, if that is so, could there possibly be some connection, could there be some spiritual parallel for America and Israel where the 490 years are concerned? In other words, is there a cycle in America's history where the 490 years comes into play? If there is, keep this in mind. The name America first appeared on a map in the year 1507. If we add 490 years to that, we come to 1997. So what am I saying? If this is correct, if this is right, if the Lord is saying, I will forgive you until 70 times 7, if that's the case, then we're living on borrowed time. I will put to you that God's grace for America is running out. Perhaps it has run out. I don't know. Certainly as individuals, God's grace endures forever. But there comes a point in time, ladies and gentlemen, that nations who have defied God, who have forgotten God, they face God's judgment. America has been a blessed nation. But I believe our role has been kind of like John the Baptist's role. You know, we've prepared a way, we've evangelized, we've witnessed, we've sent money, and still do. But just as John had to decrease so that the Messiah could increase, I believe so too we're going to decrease in prominence to make way for the nation of Israel, which is going to be, whether we like it or not, is going to be the prominent nation under Messiah's rule. So that may offend some of you. But I need to remind you that our heritage is not in D.C. or Boston or wherever. Our heritage is as believers is not there. It's not being a European American. You know, that's not our heritage. It's not an Asian American. That's not our heritage. An African American. That's not our heritage. There is a spiritual tie to Israel, whether we like it or not. We need to understand that our nation is going to decline. Now, that doesn't mean that that's an excuse for sin and all we see. I'm just saying that that's the way things are going to happen. We are going to decline in prominence as Israel rises in prominence. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that as a nation, our time has run out in that we can no longer thumb our nose. You know, we can no longer just stick our nose in the air and defy God the way we have. And I believe that God is saying time is up, and He's saying to His people, prepare, prepare, prepare. We've got to occupy till He comes. We've got to do things till He comes, and we've got to listen to the warnings of God. Okay, now let me proceed. Ominous events seem to happen on the 14th and 15th days in the springtime, and particularly in April. And let me point this out to you. The death of the firstborn, the first Passover, occurred in the month that would correspond to our April, but or March sometimes. and that is the month of Aviv, and it occurs in the spring. Well, the very first Passover occurred on the 14th and 15th. The 14th day was the death of the Passover lamb. The 15th day was the death of the firstborn. The firstborn did not die until after the nightfall. The lamb had been slain during the day previously. So the 14th and 15th day of the month of Aviv was the first Passover, the death of the firstborn. The shot heard round the world occurred in April. In fact, it occurred during Passover. President Lincoln was shot on the 14th day of April, but he died on the 15th day of April. Just a sidebar here, his death occurred on the anniversary of the shot heard round the world as it is on the Hebrew calendar. In other words, the day that the revolution started on the Hebrew calendar was the same day in history that Lincoln actually died. But the point is, he was shot on the 14th, but he died on the 15th. Titanic strikes an iceberg on the 14th of April, but it sinks on the 15th. That's very interesting. Human choices, ladies and gentlemen, set us on a particular course. We've said that, whether they be good or bad. But always, ever present in human history is the hand of God. Now, 14 is written in Hebrew characters with a Yud and Dalet. That's the gematria the gematria of Yud Dalet is 14, and that's how you would write it. Yud Dalet spells the word Yad, which means hand. 15th, as in 15, is written with Yud He. Yud He spells Yah, which means God. So when you put those two together, you have the hand of God. Isn't it interesting that these events, and I could show you many other events, happen on the 14th and 15th. Now, I want to read a scripture out of Luke chapter 4, verse 25. Jesus says, "But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land." Why was that famine brought on Israel? It was brought as a judgment on the land and on the people of Israel because they had turned to other gods. They followed the gods of Jezebel, Baal, Ashtaroth. They followed these strange gods. The worship of the God of Israel declined, and the Israelites, the people of God, literally became pagans. And so God brought judgment. But what did He do? He told the prophet, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be a time of no rain. And of course the prophet went to Ahab and said, it's not going to rain until I say. Jesus bears out that was 3.5 years. Now, this, you may not find this interesting, or I did, but it's interesting that in the story of the Titanic, when the rescue ship Carpathia that picked up all of the survivors, after he had collected all the survivors and started to New York, which was their destination, it took them 3.5 days to get there. Could this 3.5 days, this time period, these survivors going through all this stuff, could it be that alludes to this 3.5-year famine mentioned by Jesus and mentioned in the Old Testament? Or it's possible that there is a parallel story here found in the Old Testament of a time of famine, a time of lack, when God's saying to the people of God, prepare because this is what's happening. Okay, now I want to talk about judgment compared to wrath. We know that the tribulation is the time of God's wrath, but judgments can prove to be good for the righteous, but bad for the wicked. When you go into a courtroom and you're a plaintiff, first of all, you have to be prepared. You can't go in there unprepared. You have to be prepared to present your case. But when you go in there, and when the defendant goes in there, and the judge renders his decision, somebody's going to leave happy, somebody's going to leave sad. Somebody's going to leave with a victory, somebody's going to leave with a defeat. My point is, judgments can be good for the righteous. If you are in right relationship with God, if you are heeding what God is saying, then you can endure judgments. And in fact, they can benefit you. In Egypt, God judged the gods of Egypt and those who worship them. But what those judgments did, it segregated God's people from the wicked. What the wicked saw that the plagues did not affect Israel. What was the end result? When Israel finally left Egypt, the Egyptians gave them their wealth. They handed it to them, said, "Go, get out of here. Take your God with you, or we're going to die. Here's our gold. Here's our jewelry. Here's our silver. Here's all our precious metals and all our wealth." What does the Bible say? The wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. What I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is if we listen to God, if I'm right and if other people like me are right, then there stands the very real possibility that by the time this thing is over, everything that sinner, that the wicked has stored up and stored up riches and wealth and all this, we may be calling the shots before it's over with. If we're hearing from God and we know how to get through this thing, we may be calling the shots. So that's why it's important that we listen to what God is saying and use wisdom. Just like Moses, just like Joseph. Remember Joseph, he had to prepare. In fact, what did he do? He stored up food. And later on, during the time of lack, food became the commodity. And in fact, he made Pharaoh a rich and wealthy man because of his wisdom, because he had stored up food. Wicked were coming from all over the world because they heard that Egypt had stored up food, and they were giving cattle, they were giving land, they were giving gold, they were giving whatever to get food because of Joseph's wisdom and because of his relationship with God. Now, preparations. As we mentioned, the Israelites, they had to prepare with the Passover lamb. Go back to the story of the 10 virgins. Remember that story that Jesus talked about? 5 prepared, 5 did not. Preparation. Not only was it a relationship situation, because obviously the 10 virgins were all looking and waiting. So apparently they had some kind of knowledge that the bridegroom was coming. They had some kind of relationship with him. However, only half of them actually prepared for it. The other 5 did not. And what happened when the time come? They wanted the 5 who had prepared to give of their substance, and they had to go looking for it. So preparation is the word. Here's what I'm telling you. God is about and is judging the gods of America. Well, we only have one God. No, that's not true. That used to be true, but what I'm telling you is that that America has abandoned God, has deserted God, has gone out and committed adultery with other gods, the gods of money, security, or a sense of security, position, power, immorality, you name it, ladies and gentlemen. And again, if you pay attention, if you watch television, if you read the newspapers, you know what's going on around us. Our country has forsaken the God that saw the inception of this country, that has stood by this country, that has been a blessing to this country. We've abandoned him. And the church, generally speaking, is no different. We've allowed all these different things, money, power, the love of money, the love of power, immorality, you name it, it's crept into the church. And we've seen the results, how God was gently judging the church. But now, I believe that He's about to shake this nation. There is something significant about to happen. The United States, the Western world, and consequently the entire world is about to be shaken. And yes, I believe, it's my personal conviction, that we will see some of that. And if we are going to endure that somewhat comfortably, and I don't mean comfortably in this fashion that we're accustomed to, but if we're going to be able to have provision, it's going to require something of us. We need to wake up. We need to heed what God is saying. We need to listen, and we need to prepare. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have shown you that there is at least two signs, 2 ships, 2 stories that God is using to send us a message. Wake up, prepare, get prepared. An iceberg is dead ahead.
I believe that. I really believe that there is an iceberg dead ahead. I believe that now more than I did 10 years ago when we first recorded this. At this point, what I want to do is to share with you some of the information that I have learned since we recorded this 10 years ago, some of the updates to the study of the shipwreck of the Titanic. Of course, in the last 20 years since the discovery of the Titanic, deep sea research has made it possible to clear up some of the mysteries that have surrounded the sinking of the Titanic. And while she sat lost on the ocean floor, of course, experts deliberated over different aspects of the sinking, the extent of the damage that was inflicted by the iceberg, why, in spite of her ingenious design, she sank so fast, and if she broke up as she sank. And that had been a big controversy, of course, as we've already covered in the teaching. She did indeed break up. And the answer to that particular question was put to rest, at least in part, when it was discovered in 1986. Because we've all seen the videos of the two heaps of rusting steel and all the debris that lays across the ocean floor. But recent findings further suggest that the breakup is, in fact, the key to obtaining answers to the other primary questions. That is, the amount of damage that was sustained upon impact and the cause for the rapid sinking. Now, recently I watched a documentary, and this documentary was from the year 2007. And during that year, experts met at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to analyze data that was obtained from recent voyages to the wreck and to reevaluate some of the theories about the Titanic's quick demise. And the current evidence seems to pinpoint where the Titanic actually hit the iceberg and suggests that the ship was far more seriously damaged in the collision than previously realized. Before, it was thought that the collision had just left a long gash in the ship's side along the waterline, about 300 feet long, causing it to fill with water. And then as it began to sink, it broke, the steel broke, and then the ship nosedived to the bottom of the ocean. Of course, the forward section going ahead of the stern section. But upon the latest finds, experts now think that the ship actually rode up onto the iceberg, with the result being that a large section of the lower hull was actually ripped out, and that this was likely, anyway, to have been the primary cause for the ship's breaking in two, rather than its filling with water. In other words, it's believed that the ship sank because it broke up, rather than breaking up because it sank. And that, to me, struck me as very interesting and prophetically, and as I'll get to in just a moment. In the past, it was thought, and you can see this in the movie, by the way, but in the past it was thought that as the Titanic took on water, it caused the stern to rise, way up in the air, almost, perpendicular to the water. And as it did this, that the weight strain that this would have caused, the result being that the steel began to fail. However, according to the newer evidence, as water was flooding the compartments, the breakup began much sooner and at the top of the ship, not at the keel. So this collapse at the top is actually what put the strain on the rest of the ship, not so much the water. So rather than the water, causing the stern to rise up in the air like you see in the movie, the breakup of the ship is actually what caused the stern to rise. At least this is the theory at this point. And as the breakup accelerated, that's when the bow ripped apart and plunged to the bottom, and then that caused the stern to settle back down into the water. That's interesting because many survivors later claimed that it was at this point that they thought the Titanic was righting itself. Of course, they were wrong, and the end came very quickly thereafter. As a matter of fact, based on the latest evidence, the ship may have broken up and sunk more quickly than many people realized it was going to. In fact, in the transcripts, in the investigation after the sinking of the Titanic, many of the surviving crew members were just really surprised at how fast it went down. They thought they had a lot more time. Even though they knew the ship was sinking, the 1,500 people still on board were apparently taken completely by surprise when the ship began to break up. They thought they had enough time for rescuers to arrive. And some have theorized that another contributing factor to the breakup was brittle steel. Of course, we've covered that earlier in the teaching, so we won't go back over that. But just suffice it to say that there was apparently an Achilles heel, if you will, known only to God, and all it took was the right kinds of conditions, the right circumstances, the perfect storm, if you will, for this disaster to happen. That's what exposed the fatal weakness. Now, as we know, the destruction of the Titanic is absolute, completely destroyed, and that means that even after the sinking, the destruction of the Titanic has continued even to this day. Analysts have concluded that microorganisms are slowly but surely eating away at the ship's hull, and as we covered earlier, the ship is literally turning to dust, and chances are that it's just going to simply disintegrate into a big dust pile. Now, one of the things that I'd like to share here is, in looking back over these different disasters, and the Titanic, being the focus of our study today, you would think that mankind would have learned from the past and would have vowed never to repeat the same mistakes. When you consider the events that led up to the Great Depression, you would think that mankind would never make the same mistakes. You would think that knowing what we do of the rise of Adolf Hitler, how he came to power, what his aspirations were, making them very well known in advance of taking power, that we would never allow any such thing to develop ever again. You would think that. But it seems to me that at large the world is at the cusp of a time unlike anything we've ever seen since the days of Noah, who was, as we talked about, a guy who built the largest ship of his day. And so I remain confident that not only did the Titanic's destruction and the story of that ship indict the attitudes and the actions of the Edwardian world, but it continues to speak to this generation, and as I've said, specifically to modern America. Like the Titanic, the world, and in particular our nation, is steaming ahead with blind confidence, choosing to remain oblivious to the dangers ahead. We've received warnings, to slow down. For example, September 11th, 2001. But, everybody was going to put positive spin on it and try to make it to be that, yes, it's tough. Things that are not so savory are happening, but we'll overcome these things. And so our leaders, like those who piloted the Titanic, our political leaders, business leaders, and otherwise, they know the potential for danger that lurks on the horizon. In fact, many times these leaders have used these threats as a means of getting elected or influencing the financial markets or what have you. But how many of them has seriously considered changing course when confronted by these problems? The Titanic in part sank because the decision was made to skirt around the iceberg rather than to meet it head on. How many times have people, have leaders determined to meet these crises head on? We're in a time where everybody's wanting change. But who's talking about returning back to the way God said to do things, to restore the principles and the essential values that make for a righteous environment, a righteous culture, etc.? Nobody's talking about that, at least among most of our leaders. And so it seems that many of them have disregarded the warnings that have come, just as certainly as the Titanic's leaders disregarded the warnings that came their way. And though it's easy to blame our leaders for the dangers we face, we need to remember that it wasn't the designer of the Titanic or the captain of the Titanic that told Mrs. Caldwell that God couldn't sink the ship. It was actually the lowly porter. And moreover, it was the 2,000 plus people who trusted and by their actions reinforced this sentiment that the Titanic was unsinkable, because many of them refused to board lifeboats even as the bow was slipping under the sea. Therefore, I'm going to suggest to you that our more prominent citizens, our leaders, these people who get a lot of the coverage and media coverage, and the folks we like to blame for all the problems, those people are merely a reflection of the attitudes and the actions of the average American. And so our collective mindset is that, in spite of the dangers we face, nothing could really cause us to founder. Nobody really believes, with some exceptions, but most Americans find it very difficult to believe that our nation would really go under. We may suffer difficulties, we may go through hard times, but nothing could really cause the nation to founder. God wouldn't allow it, some would think. And if there's something that is able to get our attention quicker than anything else, I want to suggest to you that it's our pocketbook. I mean, we've had the war on terror. There's been, the potential for famine. There's other pressing issues. But most Americans still see the economy as the number one issue that motivates them at the ballot box. We have seen this time and time and time again. And I find this incredible, and primarily for this reason. Even though the Titanic was designed, built, and manned by British, as we pointed out earlier, she was owned by an American, J.P. Morgan, in fact. And so let me put it this way. Once again, the Titanic, the ship that God couldn't sink, is a picture of American economy and enterprise. And so I wonder, is there an iceberg out there? I think we've already seen recently how the economy is being challenged, and many people are concerned about what's going to happen. But even with all this information, with all these signs that something isn't quite right, have our advancements and all the amenities that they spawn, have they lured us into a false sense of security and contentment? In other words, have they so insulated us from hard times that we have this idea that hard times could never really come to us as Americans? And so if this false sense of security is so entrenched in our national psyche, what might God use to shake us back into reality? Now, let me point out this, that many people who perished on the Titanic did so because they could not bring themselves to leave the perceived safety and comfort of the Titanic. In other words, they were looking at a small, rickety lifeboat in the great expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, and they could not believe, even though the ship was taking on water, even though everybody knew it was sinking, they could not believe that they would be safer getting into a rickety lifeboat rather than staying on this great ship. And so that decision decided who lived and who died. Very interesting. Now, I know, again, that it's hard to believe, for some anyway, that God would not intervene if and when our nation begins to break up. Now, think about it. After 9/11, we had Democrats and Republicans meeting on the steps of the Capitol singing God Bless America, and everybody started wearing their American flags. And yet, as a nation, we've effectively told God, we don't need you. He has sent us multiple warnings through natural events, political, economic, etc., but we've essentially told him to shut up, we're busy. And so when we begin to see the consequence of our action, is it reasonable to conclude that God will not rescue us? If that happens, and frankly, I'm of the opinion that it is inevitable when we see what's going on in the world today, and especially in our country, it's inevitable that these trends, culturally and socially, are going to determine the path that this nation goes. But even then, we know that all who listen and obey the Creator are going to be secure in the midst of all these things. He is well able to provide for his people in the midst of any difficult circumstance and in the midst of any kind of situation. And yet, I would suggest that has always been a remnant. That's what it was when it came to the Titanic. It was a remnant. Where our economy is concerned, I think that most rational people understand that there are tough times ahead. I mean, there's uncertainty that lingers, and some people recognize that the ship, if you will, is taking on water. But some people, and I think most people, believe that rescue is going to come just in the nick of time, that somehow or another everything's going to work out okay. But is it possible that we're finding ourselves in the same situation that many of those that were on the sloping decks of the Titanic were in? That is, deciding, do I get into the rickety lifeboat, which doesn't look very safe, or do I stay on this great big ship, even though I know it's not looking really good right now? I realize that it's hard to believe that America, at least as we have known it, may be living out her final days. But who can deny that this country is facing unprecedented dangers with the promise of more to come? And that would be bad enough. But to face these times while our society is consistently and energetically pursuing agendas that are going to incite the anger of a holy God, that's frightening. And therefore, it is my opinion that American culture has already struck the proverbial iceberg, and the initial damage was probably more than we first imagined. The people on the lower decks, if you will, those who are at the bottom of society economically, those people can easily discern that the ship is going down. But they're powerless to do anything about it. And there are those who are simply in servitude to the culture, and they're committed to remaining at their post regardless of what happens. They're going to regurgitate the same spin that everything's going to be okay, we'll get through this tough time, et cetera, et cetera. And then those people at the top, the elite, if you will, are so intoxicated with their power and their luxuries. Number one, they're not real concerned about anyone else who's on the lower decks, if you will. And they're probably too stubborn and too proud to realize that the ship that they have built is actually sinking beneath their feet. So whatever the station in life, I believe that most Americans, in spite of the difficulties ahead, feel that somehow, some way, something's going to change, things are going to get better, and life is going to go on just as it always has. We've got plenty of time. And that is apparently, ladies and gentlemen, what took 2/3 of the passengers on the Titanic to their death. Earlier I mentioned that some of the witnesses believed that as the bow broke away and plunged downward, that the stern section settled back into the sea. And some thought momentarily the ship was going to right itself. Of course, we know that that hope was short-lived. With that in mind, I want to make an observation, not a prediction necessarily, but an observation. I believe that our fascination with money, with our pocketbook, that dictates much of what this culture thinks and does. I mean, we're willing to put up with a lot if we've got money in our hip pocket. We're willing to wink at these different issues, homosexual rights, abortion, etc. We're willing to look the other way on these issues if we have a strong economy. And so, that the future health of the economy is in question has many people troubled, some terrified, a lot of people worried about the security of their lifestyle. So, what if the economic scenario in America plays out exactly like it did for the Titanic? By that I mean, we've already seen things in recent months that suggest that we've struck an iceberg, that things aren't going well, that, if you will, we're taking on water. And a lot of people can see that the economic ship is struggling to stay afloat, but I would venture to say that most are not willing to accept that it's going to go under. What if something unexpected happened? Something very dramatic, like perhaps a $750 billion bailout that really hasn't, at least to this point, hasn't affected the economy the way they thought it would. But what if something dramatic happens and it causes the ship to begin to break up, and in the process it carries many, not all, but many under before any kind of help arrives? And then after this initial shock, and there has been damage, there have been losses, etc. But after the initial shock of this downturn, what if this economic ship appeared to right itself? And that inspired people to think that the worst was over and the economy's coming back and everything's going to start improving, et cetera, only to see just a short while later the whole bottom fall out. Again, I'm not making a prediction. It's just based on the story of the Titanic. It's an observation. And so I'll conclude with this. The finality of the message of the Titanic is this: the ship that God couldn't sink, sunk. And not only were human lives destroyed, but just another icon in a long line of icons that man had built and dedicated to himself ceased to be. And as I said, soon, this great ship will be nothing more than a pile of dust. And so, in the final analysis, the Titanic, the Tower of Babel, You name it. All these things are just grim reminders of what happens when we become so enamored with ourselves that we dare defy the judgment of a sovereign God. And so I will leave you with this. As people of God, as the men and women of God, those who desire to see righteousness prevail, we need to take heed of the warnings that he's been sending us, because I am convinced that there is an iceberg dead ahead. God bless.